Paris is on lockdown. The French capital is witnessing the fourth weekend of anti-government protests. Paris riot police clashed near the famous Champs-Élysées boulevard with protesters. Police fired tear gas in a bid to push back. Hundreds of protesters gathered around the shopping boulevard and the Arc de Triomphe monument. Police estimate that around 1,500 protesters had gathered in the area. About 8,000 police have been deployed in Paris alone to avoid a repeat of last Saturday's mayhem. Across France, nearly 90,000 police personnel have been deployed. Police say that 211 people had been arrested after they were found with weapons such as hammers, baseball bats and metal petanque balls on them. The French police used batons as they arrested a yellow vest protester in central Paris. Hundreds of protesters were milling around the Arc de Triomphe monument, which was defaced with graffiti last Saturday when rioters also torched cars and looted shops. This is the worst street violence that the country has seen in decades. French President Emmanuel Macron is expected to make a statement about the protests next week. Yellow vest protesters gathered in central Paris carrying banners against President Macron. More than 130 people have been injured in the protests so far. Around 31,000 yellow vests are protesting across France. This Saturday, 700 in total have been detained so far. Donald Trump, the President of the United States of America, has once again criticized his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron in the wake of the ongoing yellow vest protests. Landmarks like the Eiffel Tower, Arc de Triomphe, Élysée Palace, Sainte-Chapelle are closed, along with operas, theatres, libraries and major department stores as well. Music concerts and football matches also have been cancelled in view of the protests. Tourists and citizens have been instructed to remain indoors, keeping in view of the previous destruction and violence. The US, Belgium, Portugal and the Czech Republic have advised their citizens to avoid or postpone trips to Paris. Scores of high school students too have been rounded up as a precautionary measure ahead of the protests. Remember, students and farmers too have joined these protests. Protesting youth have indulged in arson and rioting in the city in the previous rounds. However, these images of students kneeling with their hands behind their heads have sparked global outrage on social media. The protests come even as the government has conceded ground and withdrawn the proposed fuel tax hike. However, what began as a protest against rising fuel prices has spiraled into large-scale demonstrations with protesters demanding the easing of the budgets of hard-pressed households and an increase in the minimum wage. US President Donald Trump took the opportunity to criticize his French counterpart. Trump took to Twitter and said, and I quote, "The Paris Agreement isn't working out so well for Paris. Protests and riots all over France. People do not want to pay large sums of money, much to third world countries, in order to maybe protect the environment. Chanting, 'We want Trump, love France.'" And now we have Elena Casas, Montanez World is One's correspondent, joining us live from Paris with the latest. Elena, talk to us, in terms of the situation. You were telling us in earlier reports about how the situation seems to be far more controlled as compared to the protests last weekend. But this even as President Macron has come under fire from world leaders. First it was US President Donald Trump, and now we have Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan as well.
Absolutely. The demonstrations have been much calmer today than what we saw last week. That's because police have adopted a radically different zero-tolerance strategy, which means they've been searching the bags and the cars of people coming up to the demonstration. They've been confiscating everything that could be used as a weapon, including hammers and petanque balls, and they've arrested at least 500 people before even there were any reports of violence this morning. We are now hearing that shop windows have been broken and that some vandalism has taken place here in central Paris, and that police have responded with tear gas and rubber bullets, but it's nowhere near the level of violence that we saw last Saturday, at least not yet. And this is because the police have adopted this zero-tolerance approach. The police and security services also went a long way in trying to dissuade people from coming out to protest today. Also, the government was saying in the run-up to today that the demonstrations would be very dangerous and that peaceful protesters shouldn't turn out to march. And that warning does seem to have been heeded. There are certainly fewer yellow vests on the march than last Saturday.
Right, Elena, the questions are now all over President Emmanuel Macron. You know, the questions like world issues like climate change is not being balanced with the financial challenges faced by his common people at the end of every month. That's what this says. That's what the criticism towards his side has been. If you look at what Donald Trump has tweeted, he said that, you know, the Paris Accord isn't working well for Paris.
Well, it would be overly simplistic to say that the yellow vests were essentially a protest about the carbon tax or that they're in some way anti-ecology. It was started, yes, as a protest against plans to raise fuel taxes in the new year, which has since been scrapped by the government. But it has become a lightning rod for a much wider range of grievances about the cost of living, which isn't to say necessarily that the standards of living or levels of poverty are particularly higher in France than elsewhere in Europe. The opposite is true. It is generally a more equal society than most European countries, but there's a huge gap between people's living standards and their expectations, and they increasingly have decided that they've had enough and that they can't get to the end of the months, and they want the government to do something. He has, of course, already done a significant policy U-turn, Emmanuel Macron, in turning around on that diesel tax, but I think a further significant policy change is going to be needed in order to calm these demonstrations. He, of course, came to power on quite a radical and controversial reforming policy for the French economy, and he said at the time that he would be pushing through those plans regardless of any resistance in the street. But he's starting to realise now, as every French president has before him, that you can't govern France against the will of demonstrators in the street, and it looks like he will be forced to change course.
He will be forced to change course, but Alina, you know, President Macron is fighting this rich tag, and also his approval ratings are steadily declining. So as far as President Macron is concerned, it's now or never to turn the tide for his government, because he will be making a statement on the protests next week, is what we understand.
Yes, he's expected to speak in the next couple of days, and what he says is likely to depend on what happens here by the end of today, how many protesters turn out and what, if any, violence happens today. He is in a very difficult position. He is, as you say, being rejected by the overwhelming majority of the French. More than 70% of people say they don't approve of him. And a lot of this, as you were saying, is about image. It's because he's perceived as being arrogant and out of touch, as governing only for the rich. His most controversial policy isn't so much the fuel tax, but the scrapping of a wealth tax, which was aimed at the rich last year, which many of the yellow vests would like to see put back in place. So it's not necessarily that they want lower taxes across the board, but they want to feel that the tax burden is being shared out more fairly. They don't feel that now, and they want to feel that the government is listening to the problems of ordinary people. And President Macron has unfortunately made a number of unforced PR errors, which have really increased this resentment, and they've increased the feeling that he really is out of touch with ordinary people, and he needs to change direction and change the way that he presents himself quite quickly in order to stave off this public anger.
And as far as staving off the public anger is concerned, there are questions also being raised on the kind of brutality that the French police have used. That video of students kneeling down with their hands behind their heads has sparked off a global outrage.
It has. We should say that the Interior Minister says that they might have been teenagers, but that they were involved in violence and that they had attacked the police, and that the ones that were arrested and held overnight were found with weapons in their bags. But it's certainly true that those pictures of high school students kneeling with their hands behind their heads have shocked a lot of people. They shocked a lot of people here in France, particularly because that happened in a part of the Paris suburbs which is quite poor and where the population is mostly ethnic minority. So a lot of people here have been saying that high school students in a wealthier and whiter area area of Paris wouldn't have been treated in the same way. So lots of the police behaviour has been controversial. Having said that, I would say that lots of what we've seen today and last week on the streets of Paris has, if anything, been restrained on the part of the riot police, given how determined some demonstrators, a minority of demonstrators, have been to cause trouble.
Elena, I just have one thing to ask you. You live in Paris, and Paris as a city is known for the huge number of protests that take place regularly, even without this entire yellow vest movement. And so, Parisians and the French in general are known to express their displeasure with the government quite often and in a very organized manner as well. What do you think has essentially changed when it comes to these yellow vest protests per se?
Yes, absolutely. It's very culturally normal in France that people take to the streets and start protesting as soon as the government does something that it doesn't like. And almost always in French history, we've seen presidents have to change tack as a result of pressure from the street. What's different about the yellow vests is that they don't really have any clear aims. That fuel tax that they were opposed to has been scrapped, and yet the protest movement hasn't stopped. And really, if you ask them why they're demonstrating, it's different for every demonstrator. They have a long and quite vague list of demands. It's gone viral on social media, which includes everything from a raise in the minimum wage to pulling France out of the European Union. All of those demands aren't consensual among all the demonstrators because they have no leadership and no clear organisation. They're organising themselves spontaneously on social media, so that does make it exceptionally difficult for the government to respond to.
Elena Casas-Montanet is getting us non-stop live updates straight from the French capital of Paris, braving a cold day in Paris. Elena, thank you so much for taking time out. For about 3 weeks, France has witnessed one of the most significant social mobilizations in its recent history. The anti-government protests have laid bare the country's social ills, the anti-elite sentiment, growing inequalities, and the thirst for social justice. Several sections of the society are opposing President Emmanuel Macron's policies and reforms as the pressure mounts on his presidency. The Yellow Vest movement started online as a grassroots rebellion against higher fuel prices, but it has morphed into a wide-ranging outlet for middle-class anger over the high costs of living in France. It cuts across different age groups and geographical regions, but primarily composed of blue-collar workers living outside of the big cities in France. Students too have joined the protests, opposing the new selection system in higher education and increased enrollment fees. Scores of high school students were rounded up today as a precautionary measure ahead of the protests. The visuals of students kneeling with their hands behind their heads have sparked outrage on social media. Meanwhile, nurses too held demonstrations against the French government as they gathered at Paris's Place de la Bastille on the fourth weekend of the Yellow Vest protests. Nurses say that they are fed up of the worsening work conditions and lack of government funding for hospitals. Railway workers too gathered at the Saint-Lazare station in Paris. They are protesting against the high cost of living and reforms introduced by Macron's administration as well. Transportation has taken a hit across France given these massive demonstrations. French farmers say that they will stage a series of protests next week. The French government will delay until early next year the rise in the minimum food price, including the wrath of the main farmers group. Agriculture Minister has blamed the proposed delay on the mass demonstrations. Farmers have long complained of being hit by a price war between retailers, which has benefited consumers but hurt producers, and they have sought to have the regulations brought in straight away. And now we have Dr. David Lees, lecturer in French Studies at the University of Warwick, joining us live. Dr. Lees, talk to us. Why exactly is Macron failing to control the French Yellow Vest protests? Because it's now crossing borders into Belgium as well.
Well, I think quite simply because he appears to be aloof. He doesn't seem to have any connection to ordinary people. And because of the sheer number of protesters across France, it's much more sizable than it has been previously. And I also think the police, therefore, are on the back foot quite frequently in this kind of opposition to the protests.
Please, despite the rollback on the fuel tax hike, can Macron change the opinion that, sort of balances business-friendly reforms and make him, aware of the burden on the working class?
Well, I think he will try and do so. I think what we may see over the next few days is a move to soften the government's stance with regards to some of the pro-business reforms. He may potentially introduce new finance ministers, for example. Indeed, I would potentially suggest that the Prime Minister, Edouard Philippe, who's behind some of these reforms, may be somebody who may have to go over the next few weeks. I think he'll try and make it appear as though it's more about ordinary people. And the main sort of purpose of doing that really is through communication, appearing to be more sort of on the same level as ordinary people.
Dr. Lees, can President Macron fight the president of the rich tag and his steadily declining approval ratings?
Well, I think it's inevitable that his approval ratings will continue to fall. And I think, unfortunately for Macron, he's in a very difficult position where, like some of his predecessors, he promised to make reforms. Those reforms have not really appeared as yet. And therefore, he will be held against them. And I think, ultimately his popularity will continue to fall. But the main thing to say, I suppose, is there is a majority for Macron in National Assembly. He's not going to go anywhere anytime soon, but he's not going to increase his popularity.